Shortly after the turn of the century, 8-year-old Harold B. Lee, future president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, left his humble farmhouse in the Cache Valley of southern Idaho on a journey that would bring him in touch for the first time with his prophetic destiny.
My father had grown up in Salt Lake City. Naturally, he was anxious for his boys to see some of the scenes he had remembered as a boy. So it was decided that we would go down to attend General Conference. He took his 2 oldest boys. I was second oldest. Of course, the pending conference as such was not our most immediate interest. We wanted to see the sights of the big city. My earliest recollection, I was just a young lad, was sitting in the south gallery of the Salt Lake Tabernacle and looking down at the pulpit and seeing President Joseph F. Smith sitting there. I was impressed at seeing for the first time the president of the church.
Young Harold would never meet Joseph F. Smith in his mortal life, and yet there were on that stand 4 members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles: Heber J. Grant, George Albert Smith, David O. McKay, and Joseph Fielding Smith, with whom this curious boy would have many future sacred meetings. 34 years after this conference, President Heber J. Grant would call Harold B. Lee to the sacred apostleship. Harold would then serve in this special calling under Presidents George Albert Smith and David O. McKay. And lastly, this humble young man would in many years hence be called as first counselor to President Joseph Fielding Smith before serving as president of the church himself.
Certainly, as young Harold reverently watched these men from the balcony, he had no idea of what lay ahead. To him, the world consisted of family, friends, farm, and school. But as this young man faced each day with faith and hard work, he grew step by step into his divinely appointed role. Without fanfare or hype, Harold B. Lee lived a life true to the faith of his Father in heaven. He honored his parents, and he served the Latter-day Saint people with all his heart and soul. Truly, the wide-eyed 8-year-old in the south balcony lived a life worthy of his sacred destiny as a modern prophet of God.
William Lee, the great-great-great-grandfather of the future prophet, was the first Lee ancestor to settle in the land of America. He left his home in Carrickfergus, Ireland in the year 1770, and after a long voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, arrived in the port city of Philadelphia. Over 60 years and 2 generations later, Francis Lee, the grandson of William, would bring Harold another important step closer to his prophetic destiny.
My great-grandfather, Francis Lee, joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at Randolph County, Indiana in 1832. My great-grandmother, Jane Vale Johnson, joined at the same time, and they were married in 1835.
It is significant to note that President Lee's ancestors joined the church just 2 years after the Restoration began. Clearly, the Lord was preparing a heritage through which this great foreordained leader could come and fulfill his role in magnifying the calling that he had as a great leader in the latter-day work.
As members of the newly organized faith, Francis and Jane were humble victims in the terrible persecutions that followed the early saints from Missouri to Nauvoo. Following the bloody martyrdom of Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram, they joined with the body of the church in the long and arduous journey across the plains and into the valleys of the Rocky Mountains.
And so, the Lee family established roots in the rugged settlements of the West. Under the direction of Brigham Young, they stopped first in Tooele before moving on to Utah's Dixie. Samuel Marion Lee Sr., Harold's grandfather, settled with his young wife Margaret in Panaca, a Mormon colony southwest of St. George. There, the young couple had hopes of raising a family. Unfortunately, Margaret was often sick and found great difficulty in childbearing.
Margaret and Samuel Lee Sr. had lost 10 babies that were either stillborn or they died after birth. After the 10th baby died, Patriarch Abel Lamb of Salt Lake City paid them a visit. In giving Margaret a patriarchal blessing, Brother Lamb promised her that through her righteousness she would be blessed with a son. And he further said that this man would be a mighty man in Israel and that he would be named after his father. Well, that renewed their faith. And so Samuel and Margaret tried again to have a child, but the 11th child was stillborn. They tried again, refusing to give up, and again Margaret gave birth. This 12th baby was very premature. It only weighed about 3.5 pounds, but he lived, and in a fulfillment of the blessing, he was named just as the father had been directed, Samuel Marion Lee, Jr.
Unfortunately, Margaret Lee would live just 8 short days after the miraculous birth of her precious son. As a result, Samuel Marion Jr., Harold B. Lee's earthly father, was then taken to Salt Lake City and raised by his maternal grandparents, Joseph and Margaret McMurrin. And Samuel Marion Sr., who was busy with the settlement in the South, would visit his son as often as possible.
At the tender age of 18, Samuel Marion Jr. faced the awful experience of having his grandmother McMurrin, who was in essence his mother, die in his arms. Following this tragic loss, Samuel was sent north to live with his aunt and uncle, Riley and Jeanette Davis, in Clifton, Idaho. And shortly after his arrival in southern Idaho, Samuel met Harold's dear mother, Louisa Bingham.
A third-generation Latter-day Saint, Louisa, too, had ancestors who joined the church in the Midwest and then made the fateful journey across the plains. Louisa was the second oldest in her family, but her older sister Sarah died at the age of 3. As Louisa grew into adolescence, her mother became very ill and was often bedridden. This left Louisa not only responsible for the care of her younger siblings, but of her invalid mother as well. Needless to say, the challenges of her youth prepared Louisa to be an exceptional wife and mother. And so, in the spring of 1895, Samuel Marion Lee Jr. and Louisa Emmeline Bingham were sealed for time and all eternity in the Logan Temple.
Deciding to remain in Clifton, Idaho, the young couple settled on a small farm and were soon blessed with a family of their own. With the help of a midwife, Louisa gave birth to her second son, Harold B. Lee, on a brisk March 28, 1899. Samuel was working out of town at the time, leaving just mother and 3-year-old brother Perry to welcome him into the world.
And the world into which young Harold was born was a world of good old-fashioned hard work. For life in Cache Valley, Idaho was almost inevitably farm life. Almost as soon as they were able to walk, Perry and Harold and their 4 younger siblings were given chores around the house and duties on the spacious family farm. Older brother Perry wrote of the Lee family work ethic.
In our family, everyone was required to work in some degree according to his ability. Our father was a firm believer that we were here to literally work out our salvation, with the emphasis on work. It became an axiom that if we would eat well, we must labor for the things which we needed.
By the age of 5, young Harold was prepared to add another layer to his workload: school.
If there's a consistent pattern of the life of Harold B. Lee, it might be that he was always ahead of his time. He seemed to always move prior to those of his age group into experiences of greater responsibility. This started really early in his life. When he went to school, I suppose just by accident, trailing along his older brother Perry, on the first day of school. But when the teacher found that he already knew how to write his name and he knew the alphabet, he persuaded the Lee parents to allow him to start school. So he started 1 year earlier than his peers. This actually went on all through his life.
Harold's mother was a talented seamstress, and she would often trim the boys' outfits with lace, which they would promptly tuck under so their friends would not make fun of them. However, Louisa did something even more trying with her second son. Disappointed that her first children were not girls, she did what she could with the boys.
Oh, these ringlets are so cute.
Leaving young Harold's hair long, she curled it carefully in front and back into delicate ringlets. Then, dressing him in short pants and a ruffled, lacy top, she sent him off to school. His brother Perry recorded the events that followed.
When Harold arrived at school, still with his mass of beautiful hair, it may have been the first time he went into training for the hard knocks of life to come.
Nice hair.
Suffice it to record that those curls caused more skin knuckles and black eyes than either politics or religion.
Let's go, buddies. Let's go.
When Harold was finally able to get his hands on a pair of scissors, he cut the front ringlets right off. Louisa wept when she saw what he had done, but realizing that the effect was ruined, she went ahead and allowed her husband to cut the rest of his curls off as well.
My great-grandmother, Louisa Bingham Lee, preserved the shorn locks. And a couple of years later, when my great-grandfather Bingham was a deputy warden at the Idaho State Penitentiary, he asked one of the inmates to braid the locks into 2 watch chains, which my great-grandmother treasured and kept for many years.
With the days of curly locks behind him, young Harold pursued his studies for the next 7 years at the Clifton School without further disruption. During these years of growing and learning, it was evident that this future prophet was being watched over and protected.
Good.
On one occasion, young Harold traveled with his father to Dayton, a town south of Clifton, where the Lees owned a small 40-acre farm. While his father was tending to duties on the farm, Harold wandered off to explore some old buildings on the property. However, as the boy approached a pile of old lumber, he heard a distinct and audible voice saying, "Harold, don't go near that lumber over there." Sensitive to the whisperings of the spirit, even at this young age, the boy heeded the voice and returned to his father. He never discovered the danger that lurked near the old woodpile. Ever since then, the boy, to become prophet, knew that God could speak to him when needed.
Harold's sweet mother also served as his protector more than once during his youth. One time, Harold was helping his mother to make some soap, and the two were lifting a large pan of lye down from a high shelf when the pan toppled over, spilling its contents onto Harold's head and face. Reacting quickly, Louisa held Harold to keep him from running away, and then, with her other hand, opened a nearby jar of pickles. She scooped out the vinegar and poured it over the boy to negate the burning effect of the lye.
Once, when Harold was 17, Louisa nursed her son with the only medical knowledge she had. After trying a series of mustard plasters on his chest, which brought no relief, she chopped a number of onions and boiled them. Then, wrapping the onions in a cloth, she placed the remedy on Harold's chest. The primitive treatment alleviated the boy's suffering, and by morning, he was feeling better.
There was an incredible event in the childhood of President Harold B. Lee that showed the intense love that his mother had for him and her deep spirituality. As a young boy, he was standing in the doorway of the home in Clifton, Idaho, observing a spectacular lightning storm that was occurring there in the valley. And all of a sudden, without warning, his mother, Louisa Lee, or Grandma Great as we called her, dashed across the room, literally pushing him away from the doorway, just as a lightning bolt came down the smokestack of their pot-bellied stove and exited right through the very same doorway where he had been standing. It subsequently went and split a tree out in the yard of the home. So her motherly intuition and her deep spirituality had literally saved the life of a future prophet.
In recalling this unique event and the spiritual nature of his mother, President Lee recorded the following in his journal.
My mother could never explain her split-second decision. All I know is that my life was spared because of her impulsive, intuitive nature. Years later, when I saw the deep scar on that large tree at the old family home, I could only say from a grateful heart, thank the Lord for that precious gift possessed in abundant measure by my own mother and by many of the faithful mothers through whom heaven can be very near in time of need.
On June 9, 1907, 8-year-old Harold was baptized a member of the church in Bybee Pond near his home. In this same period of his life, Harold began taking piano lessons. His teacher, Mrs. Sarah Gerard, used some rather harsh teaching techniques. His brother Perry wrote of this time.
Harold learned early to play the piano under the tutelage of a Scottish lady named Gerard, who was prone to rap knuckles at the sound of a wrong note. Soon, he was playing the piano for primary and Sunday school.
Because he had started school 2 years earlier than boys his age, Harold was ordained a deacon when he was just 10 years old. Remaining faithful to his studies, young Harold completed grade school in the spring of 1912 at the spry age of 13. And this accomplishment would, for all practical purposes, signal the end of Harold's childhood, for in just several months he would enter high school and take another step toward his prophetic destiny.
In the fall of 1912, Harold's parents enrolled him in the Oneida Stake Academy. This church-directed high school was located in Preston, Idaho, across the valley from the Lee home. The academy was, however, distant enough that Harold would not live at home for the next 4 years, except during summers, when he would return to help with the farm. Harold roomed with his brother Perry in a boarding house across the street from the two-building campus. He wrote about these accommodations.
Living in this same house were a total of 13 boys, and one could easily guess the impromptu party staged. Underneath our room were the quarters of the principal of the school, J. Robert Robinson. On various occasions, he appeared and soundly scolded us for the ceiling-cracking performance we sometimes staged.
Young Hal Lee, while maintaining his studies, seemed to be involved in everything else the school had to offer as well. Having already learned to play the piano, he focused musically on learning to play the alto and French horns for the school band. He also took great interest in the athletics programs. His favorite sport was basketball, and he was said to be a rather good player.
Busy as he was with music and sports, Harold also found time to participate on the school's debate team, which during his senior year won the tournament against the renowned Fielding Academy in Paris, Idaho. Harold wrote of this in his journal.
Never in the history of our school had a team defeated Fielding Academy at Paris, but we succeeded in turning the tables in a thrilling 2-1 decision. They gave us a banquet following the debate, and the next day we returned to Preston as conquering heroes, and our student body gave us a real reception in a special assembly.
Harold B. Lee's mother, Louisa Bingham Lee, apparently was not an overly affectionate woman physically, but she showed her love in very tangible ways that meant a great deal to her children. Harold always remembered an experience he had when he was a teenager. He was very involved with debate, and he had a chance to go away on a debate meet. So he went away, and apparently he was very successful. He won the tournament, was very excited about this. And on his way home, he called his mother and started to tell her about what had happened. And she stopped him, and she said, "I know, son, I know all about it." And he said, well, how do you know? And she said, while you were gone, I went outside by the willows, and I prayed to God that you would not fail. And Harold B. Lee said about that incident, I have come to know that that kind of love from a mother is critical and important for every son and daughter who expects to achieve in this life.
Arriving at the end of 4 very busy and successful years at the Oneida Stake Academy, Harold graduated in the spring of 1916. It was then decided that Harold could best help the financially strapped Lee family by pursuing an Idaho teaching certificate.
After spending several weeks studying so hard that he lost nearly 20 pounds, Harold passed the entrance exams for the Albion Normal School, located some 30 miles outside of Burley. The isolated nature of the school made it easy for Harold to focus on his studies. And so by the end of the summer, he had earned his second-degree teaching certificate at the age of 17.
That winter, young Harold Lee took his first job as a school teacher in the one-room Silver Star School near Weston, Idaho for $60 a month. Harold found himself teaching nearly 25 students at different levels of grades 1 through 8. He faced the task, however, with determination and faith, calling on his Father in heaven for help.
Almost nightly, I placed my school problems before the Lord. And although I never worried so much over a work, the Lord never deserted me, and I learned some of the most valuable lessons of self-mastery in my life.
Each class member was important to Harold, but he took extra care with his youngest student, the only first grader at the school. Harold's older brother Perry said this of their unique bond.
His lone first grader, Vassal by name, was either his greatest problem or his prize pupil, for I heard his name muttered often in his nighttime dreams as he visited home on weekends.
One of the fun stories that came out of Harold's experience at Silver Star School involved a picket fence that surrounded the school. Young Harold had been given strict instructions by the school board that the children were not to walk on top of the fence for fear of injury. Well, during the first week of school, Harold looked out the window, and what should he see but his young first grader standing on his hands on the fence? Well, he quickly grabbed his camera, took a picture of the boy with his feet high in the air in order to prove to the school board that there was much more to worry about than simply children walking on the fence.
With the completion of that school year, Harold returned for the summer of 1917 to the Albion Normal School, where he then earned his third-degree teaching certificate. That fall, he was promoted within the school system and assigned as teacher and principal of the district school in Oxford, Idaho. This new position came with several benefits. His salary increased to $90 per month, and he had 2 associate teachers, Velma Sperry and Tressie Lincoln, who took responsibility for the younger students. He was also able to live at home with his family, which saved on boarding expenses. However, there were increased challenges to be found at the Oxford School as well.
At age 18, President Lee was appointed as a teacher and the principal of the Oxford District School in southern Idaho. This covered all of the grades, basically from kindergarten through high school, and it put him in the unique situation where he had to be responsible for students that were, in some cases, larger and older than he was. He chose to accomplish that utilizing a method that actually served him well through the rest of his life. He, at lunchtime, would change into his gym clothes and go outside and play basketball with the students. That gave him an opportunity to establish a common ground and to establish a friendship with them that he could not have done in any other way.
During Harold's 3-year tenure at the Oxford School, he turned his monthly paycheck over to his family to repay his parents for having financed his schooling over the years. In an effort to make a little extra money for himself, Harold learned to play the trombone and joined with the Frew Brothers in their 5-piece band called the Frew Orchestra. Harold reminisced about this experience.
We were the only dance orchestra from Logan, Utah on the south to Pocatello, Idaho on the north, and it was not uncommon for us to play 2 and 3 nights a week. On occasion, it was almost morning before we arrived home.
The time that Harold Lee spent in the band was of great concern to his parents for 2 reasons. The first one was that it took a great deal of time in the evenings and often left him very tired and worn down for his job as a full-time principal and school teacher. But secondly, they were concerned about the moral challenges that faced young Harold in that dance hall environment.
Yet despite the many temptations that surrounded him at this time, Harold B. Lee maintained strict obedience to the principles of morality that he had been taught in his days of youth. It was, in fact, during this same time that Harold was ordained an elder in the Melchizedek priesthood and was shortly thereafter called to serve as the Elders Quorum president.
A school teacher at 17, a principal at 18, and an Elders Quorum president before he was 20. Clearly, Harold B. Lee was following the path of his prophetic destiny.
No tea or coffee, strong.
In the spring of 1920, having completed his 3rd year as principal and teacher at the Oxford School, Harold counseled with his father, who was then serving as the bishop of the Clifton Ward, concerning the possibility of Harold serving a mission. Despite the financial burden it would place on his struggling family, Bishop Lee humbly recommended his son as a missionary. And in September of 1920, a letter from the prophet arrived at the Lee home in Clifton.
Harold B. Lee was called by President Heber J. Grant to serve in the Western States Mission, headquartered in Denver, Colorado.
I've been called to serve as a full-time missionary in the Western States Mission. The States, that's great.
An enthusiastic Harold then set about quickly to make final preparations for his missionary service, acquiring the necessary wardrobe and saying his goodbyes to family and friends. But most important of all, he traveled with his father to the Logan Temple, where he received his sacred endowment in the house of the Lord. From Logan, Elder Lee bid farewell to his father and traveled by train to Salt Lake City, where he was to be set apart. Of the separation from his family and the challenge laid before him, Harold recorded his feelings.
I never realized how great a gap my family filled in my life until I bade them goodbye. The parting words of my father when I left for the mission field were, "Harold, my boy, your father and mother are looking for big things from you."
In Salt Lake on November 9th, 1920, Elder Lee was set apart by Brigham H. Roberts of the 70 and was assigned Elder Owen H. Martin as his traveling companion.
Arriving in Denver by train on November 11th, they were met by President John M. Knight and assigned companions. Harold was paired with Willis J. Woodbury of Salt Lake, and it was clear from the start that they were a match made in heaven.
Elder Woodbury was excited to find out that Elder Lee played the piano, so they devised a unique approach to missionary work. Elder Woodbury would carry his cello, and they would knock on a door and inquire if there was a piano within. When they discovered that there was a piano, they would go and perform, hoping that the musical introduction would enlighten the situation so that they could present a message about the gospel of Jesus Christ.
This unique musical introduction helped the elders get in some homes, but they still faced their share of slammed doors. And Harold struggled with this rejection, as do all new missionaries.
Besides tracting, the other common missionary practice in Denver was holding street meetings. The elders and sisters would basically find a busy street corner and start preaching. Elder Lee wrote of his first street meeting in his journal.
I thought I would surely faint until I got started. Then somehow I forgot myself and everyone else. I think if I keep on finding out how little I know, by the time my mission is over, I will be convinced I don't know anything.
Fortunately, that was not the case for this humble missionary. Elder Lee met with much success in the early months of his mission. So much success that President Knight called Harold to be the president of the Denver Conference after just 9 months in the field. In this capacity, 22-year-old Elder Harold B. Lee became the presiding officer over not only 35 missionaries, but also the entire membership of the conference, or district, as it would be called today.
Harold was only in the mission for 9 months before he was named the district president. In those days, there were no secretaries of the mission, there were no assistants to the mission. He was the only missionary assistant to President Knight. Now that meant that he presided over the saints. He had to listen to their marital disputes and counsel them. He conducted the funerals for the saints. All the time he was presiding over 35 missionaries who were ranging from almost to the Nebraska line up to the Wyoming line. And he had a great responsibility.
Accustomed to hard work and a busy schedule from his days in school and teaching, Elder Lee moved the work forward in an amazing fashion. The number of baptisms in the conference increased dramatically under his leadership. Elder Lee's leadership style centered on leading by example. He, in fact, organized a program some have called a precursor to home teaching, in an effort to give himself more time to work in the field. In this program, each missionary companionship was assigned several member families to visit once a month.
Would you please read here in Moroni, verse 3?
As president of the Denver Conference, Harold also worked in close association with President Knight, whose office was located in Denver. On several occasions, Elder Lee was invited to travel with President Knight as he toured the mission. Just several weeks before his release, Elder Lee was called upon by President Knight to conduct a conference in Sheridan, Wyoming in his absence. He left Elder Lee in charge, saying there was no one else he would rather trust.
In December of 1922, a choked-up President Knight announced the release of Elder Harold Lee, whose 2 years of service had come to an end. It is significant to note that Harold's replacement as president of the Denver Conference was 62-year-old Andrew Hood. Certainly, this young man from Clifton, Idaho, had accomplished big things in the Western States Mission. Returning through Salt Lake, Harold was invited by President Knight to attend the Ensign Stake Conference in the Assembly Hall on Temple Square. As the conference was attended by many general authorities, including even President Heber J. Grant, the returning missionary was surprised by an invitation to speak. This was Elder Lee's first opportunity to speak from a pulpit on Temple Square, but certainly not his last.
Taught musically by playing the piano.
Before leaving Salt Lake City and returning to his family in Clifton, Idaho, Harold Lee made one very important contact with Sister Fern Tanner. Fern had also served in the Western States Mission, arriving just 2 weeks before Elder Lee. The two became acquainted early on in their missions before Fern was transferred out of Denver, at which point they maintained a friendship through occasional letters. Upon completing her mission, Sister Tanner had returned to Salt Lake in July of 1922. After visiting with Fern, Harold then made the journey to Clifton, arriving home just before Christmas, and he rejoiced to be with his dear family again.
As the spirit of the holidays faded, so did Harold's excitement at being home. He greatly missed the enthusiastic spirit of the mission field and, of course, the mantle that he had as a missionary. He also faced the very natural feelings of being let down after being associated with going from a position of prominence and being needed, like being conference president, to being just a regular member of the church in a typically large and unmotivated ward.
An important factor in Harold's discontent was his inability to get work, since it was mid-year in the school system and no teaching contracts were open. Harold did his best to stay busy helping his father on the farm, and was eventually called again as the Elders' Quorum president, which alleviated some of his frustration.
In an effort to lift his older brother's spirit, Clyde invited Harold to play in a friendly game of basketball with him and his friends. Not in the shape he used to be in, Harold suffered a back injury which aggravated a hernia that had developed during his mission. In consequence, Harold traveled to Salt Lake City several weeks later for a hernia operation. While recovering, however, he was invited to stay in the home of his dear friend Fern Tanner. And it was during this time of recuperation that Harold and Fern decided to marry.
Upon returning to Clifton, Harold counseled with his parents and determined to move to Salt Lake City in order that he might pursue his marriage plans and further promote his teaching career. Arriving back in Salt Lake, Harold soon discovered that he would need to take additional courses at the University of Utah to bring his teaching accreditation up to the state of Utah's standards. Upon completing his schooling that summer, Harold received his teaching certificate and shortly thereafter was hired once again as teacher and principal of the Whittier School in Salt Lake.
On November 14, 1923, Harold and Fern knelt at the altar of the Salt Lake Temple and were sealed for time and all eternity by George F. Richards of the Council of the 12. Of their sacred union, Harold recorded his feelings.
Never doubting our ability to get ahead together, we put our full trust in each other and moved into our first home at 1538 West, 800 South. The first year of our married life was a glorious honeymoon, in which we made preparations for our first baby.
Maureen Lee, a darling baby girl, was added to the Lee family on September 1st, 1924. 14 months later, a second daughter was born to Harold and Fern. However, dangerous complications during both pregnancies would restrict their ability to have any more children.
Residing within the boundaries of the Pioneer Stake on the west side of Salt Lake, Harold was soon recognized for his organizational and leadership skills. He was first called as the M-Men instructor, supervising the activities and instruction of all the Aaronic priesthood young men in the ward. His unique and swift ability to reorganize and rejuvenate the M-Men program led to new callings as the ward and eventually stake Sunday school superintendent. At the age of 28, he was called to serve on the Pioneer Stake High Council and was set apart by Elder Richard R. Lyman of the 12 Apostles.
In 1928, Harold resigned his position in the school system and accepted employment with Foundation Press Incorporated, a company that published and marketed classic literature. As a salesman for this new company, Harold's salary increased dramatically. With this adjustment in income, the Lees purchased the home that Fern had grown up in, allowing her parents to move into a situation that better suited their retired lifestyle. With roots planted firmly now in the Pioneer Stake, Harold Lee was clearly where the Lord needed him to be.
At the 1928 October Conference of the Pioneer Stake, held in the Assembly Hall, Harold, just 29 at the time, was stunned when from the pulpit he was called as the second counselor to the stake president. Harold humbly assumed his position. However, his time as second counselor would not be long.
In the fall of 1930, the Pioneer Stake presidency was to be reorganized by Rutger Clausen and George Albert Smith. On the Friday prior to conference, Harold Lee was asked to meet with these two apostles.
In meeting with President Rutger Clausen and Elder George Albert Smith, Harold was informed suddenly that the First Presidency wanted him to be the new stake president of the Pioneer Stake. Well, that was quite a shock. And Harold replied rather humbly that he'd much prefer to continue serving as a counselor to President Charles Hyde. Well, Elder Smith bluntly replied that Harold had not been invited there to tell him what should be done, but rather to tell him whether or not he was willing to do what the Lord wanted him to do. Well, with that kindly rebuke, he accepted the call, and he became the new stake president.
As the youngest stake president at the time in the church, Harold was concerned about how he would be accepted and that there may be some feelings or opposition. During the early period of his presidency, after an audit revealed that a bishop had been guilty of impropriety with use of funds, he pressed forward and disciplined the bishop, and this gained the respect of the High Council and the members that he had the courage to proceed with such a difficult matter.
On December 1st, 1932, Harold entered the world of politics. He was appointed Salt Lake City's Commissioner of the Department of Public Streets and Improvements, filling a position left open by the death of the former commissioner.
Therefore, in 1933, it became President Lee's ambition to be elected to the same position when the commissioner's term expired. Not surprisingly, Harold organized an effective and efficient campaign, which resulted in his election to the position. As city commissioner, Harold supervised a department of over 250 employees and was responsible for the construction and repair of roads in Salt Lake. He was also in charge of snow removal, which demanded a great deal of attention throughout the winter months.
While managing the affairs of this public department, Harold was also faced with a great challenge in his ecclesiastical assignment. The effects of the Great Depression were being felt severely within the Pioneer Stake, whose boundaries contained many of Salt Lake's most humble neighborhoods. In 1933, unemployment rate was 25%, and in the Pioneer Stake, over half of the members were receiving financial aid from sources outside the family. President Lee met regularly with his counselors to prayerfully consider ways that they might remedy the hardships faced by so many within the stake. They eventually developed a welfare program that was basically the precursor to the church welfare program in place today.
Food was the major need, and the major available resource was manpower. Therefore, needy members of the stake were contracted to work on local farms, which gave the stake a portion of their harvest. A stake warehouse canned and then distributed the food items to those who had performed the work. The Pioneer Stake Welfare Program worked incredibly well and attracted attention from struggling communities around the nation. It also caught the attention of the First Presidency, who were at the same time considering possible aid programs for the church worldwide.
Then, in 1935, Brother Lee was called in by the First Presidency to a very special meeting. If I remember right, it was a Saturday morning. And believe it or not, he was with those brethren for 3 whole hours. And during that period of time, President Grant and his counselors asked him if he would organize a welfare program for the whole church. And they put him in charge of it. And a little later on, they gave him the title as Managing Director of the Church Security Program. And that went on for a couple of years, and they changed it to Church Welfare Program. But it was Harold B. Lee who had the responsibility to organize the program. So he visited with a lot of fine men in the city, good businessmen, got ideas of what we might do. And then he went up into City Creek Canyon, where he went really to think and to pray, wondering what kind of an organization the church would have to have in order to have a church-wide welfare program. And so while he was there, he got the impression that he didn't need anything other than to put the priesthood to work. And he didn't invent a new organization. He just came up with the idea of delegating to the stake presidents and to the bishops the responsibility to run this new program.
President Lee spent nearly 6 months designing his plan based on this revelation. In the months that followed, his program was accepted by the First Presidency and the 12. It was officially announced as the Church Security Plan in April of 1936, exactly 1 year from the time Harold was given the assignment. And in launching the new program, the First Presidency called President Lee as the managing director, which would require a full-time commitment. Consequently, Harold resigned as a city commissioner.
In getting the program up and running, Harold would spend the next 5 years traveling extensively around the state and the nation. Almost every weekend was spent in special training sessions with local leaders. All in all, the program was meeting with great success, and saints across the struggling nation were being blessed. Certainly, the humble pioneer stake president had magnified his office.
If there was any doubt as to how the First Presidency viewed the success of the welfare program, it was wiped out on April 5th of 1941. Following the priesthood session of General Conference, Harold, in a private meeting with President Heber J. Grant, was called as a member of the 12 Apostles.
After his rather somber meeting with President Grant, following priesthood meeting, President Lee drove home to share the rather humbling and awesome news with his family, only to recall that the home was full of conference visitors. And he found it very awkward to find the moment to which to reveal this news to his wife and family. Maureen was not home at the time. She was at a friend's home, and she called fortuitously, asking for a ride home. Harold seized the opportunity and put the family in the car and picked up Maureen, and there in the automobile shared this awesome and humbling experience with them.
The next day, Harold was sustained in the Sunday morning session of General Conference. Naturally, he detailed this unique event in his journal.
I was sustained before the General Conference by President J. Reuben Clark, Jr., after which I was invited to a place on the stand at the foot of the ladder, as he expressed it, a member of the 12.
Taking his place with the other members of the 12, Harold stood out like a sore thumb. He had thick black hair as opposed to the gray or bald heads of the others. Harold was, after all, just 42 years old. The next youngest member of the council was 62, 20 years Harold's senior.
With the onset of World War II, there were many concerns the brethren faced with the challenges to members, their needing comfort and counsel. Elder Lee was called upon in 1942 to counsel with LDS servicemen who were preparing to leave for the war. And again in 1945, he was called upon to counsel with those servicemen as they returned from the war, helping them to deal with many of the emotions and feelings of the terrible events they'd been through.
When World War II came, Brother Lee was given some special assignments by the President of the Church to watch over the chaplains and the servicemen. We didn't have our rightful share of chaplains, according to the different religious organizations, because none of our chaplains had been through a school of divinity. And in order to become a chaplain in the military, you had to be a graduate of a school of divinity. So President McKay sent him to Washington to meet with the Secretary of Defense, and I went with him. And I remember going to Washington. Brother Willard Marriott, who started the Marriott Corporation, took us from New York down, and we went to the Pentagon. Brother Marriott had arranged the appointment for Brother Lee to meet the Secretary of Defense. And when we got there, the Secretary of Defense didn't want to meet with Brother Lee, so his undersecretary met with him, incidentally, who was a far more understanding person. And Brother Lee was able to explain the church's position. And as a result, we got extra chaplains and extra help from the federal government that we wouldn't have had.
As the war was coming to a close, Elder Lee traveled to Hawaii, the point of return for most soldiers fighting in the Pacific, to inspect the LDS servicemen's facilities and to meet with members and missionaries there. First stopping at the military cemetery in Honolulu, the young apostle paid tribute to all the Mormon GIs who had given their lives in defense of their nation. He then toured the military facilities and visited with the church branches on each island. This trip was Elder Lee's first foray outside of North America, and he was overjoyed to find whole branches of the church made up of the beautiful Asian and Polynesian peoples.
On his return to the mainland, Harold B. Lee's intimate knowledge of the welfare program proved to be a great asset to the 12 in dealing with post-war Reconstruction issues in Europe and the Pacific. In May of 1945, President Grant passed away, and Elder Lee witnessed firsthand the faithful transferring of the reins to the senior apostle, in this case, George Albert Smith.
After Brother Lee had been in the 12 for a while, he was asked to give a series of talks on KSL. They were called Youth in the Church. But because he talked directly to the young people of the church, all of a sudden the young people were wanting to hear Harold B. Lee. He was 20 years younger than the next member of the 12 apostles. And that made a profound impression upon the young people of the church. As a result, he began to marry more and more people. Now, he would have 2 and 3 marriages in a day. Now, I marry people in the temple, and I can do 2 in a row, but, you know, I've thought a lot about Brother Lee, and that vigorous, powerful, strong man that he was, took all of his physical strength to keep up with his spiritual strength and the demands that were made upon him.
Of special significance to Elder Lee, however, was a temple sealing he performed on June 24, 1946. Elder Lee wrote,
I had the glorious experience of sealing my own baby daughter, Helen, to L. Brent Goats. It was the greatest experience of my life.
Just a year later, Elder Lee was afforded the opportunity once again as he sealed his older daughter, Maureen, to Ernest J. Wilkins on June 11, 1947.
In 1951, President George Albert Smith was called home, and David O. McKay, the senior apostle, was ordained as the new prophet of the church. Under this new president, Harold B. Lee's ministry would take on a significantly more expanded route, a route that would eventually circle the globe.
In 1953, on assignment from the First Presidency, Harold and Fern first traveled west across the vast Pacific Ocean to visit the members and missionaries in the Orient. Touring through Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, and the Philippines, Elder and Sister Lee saw incredible potential for growth among these small but faithful Asian branches.
Elder and Sister Lee also visited with LDS servicemen stationed at U.S. naval and marine bases located throughout the Orient. And Elder Lee was clearly impressed with these young Mormon GIs.
I think my appraisal of what I saw among the boys there might best be expressed in what Ralph Waldo Emerson said.
It is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after one's own. But the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude.
Such is the way I found our boys, with the marks of greatness upon their brows.
In Tokyo, Elder Lee participated in 2 special meetings. The first was with Japanese leaders of 15 non-Christian denominations and was supposed to last just 1 hour. However, so interested were these leaders in the Mormon Church that Elder Lee, with the help of an interpreter, ended up teaching them of the Lord's latter-day work for more than 3 hours.
The second special meeting in Tokyo was held with the 80 missionaries of the Japanese mission. This testimony meeting lasted more than 6 hours. It gave Elder Lee great insight into the success being found in Japan in recent years.
Also significant on this tour of the church in Asia was a stop made by Elder Lee in Hong Kong, visiting the spot where Elder Matthew Cowley dedicated the land of China for the preaching of the gospel some 5 years earlier. Elder Lee added his own prayer that missionary work would in the future be opened up among Chinese people. In 1956, Elder Lee was sent on assignment with Elder Spencer W. Kimball to divide the Mexico mission.
Traveling by train, the two apostles arrived in Monterrey, where they visited with members and missionaries before traveling by car to Mexico City. There, they held a meeting with members and missionaries and created the Northern Mexico Mission, which would be headquartered in Monterrey.
In 1958, Elder and Sister Lee were given a special assignment by President McKay to tour the mission in South Africa. After making a one-day stop in Rome, they arrived in Johannesburg on October 4th, 1958, and were met by President Fisher of the South African Mission.
Under the guidance of President Fisher, Elder and Sister Lee attended conferences throughout the mission, traveling along the entire south coast from Durban to Cape Town.
The spiritual highlight of the South African mission tour came in the city of Durban. There the saints had gathered for their conference, and they had heard a marvelous address from Brother Lee, and the meeting was closed. But no one moved in their seats. They were silent. The branch president arose and said, "What is it you want? Do you want to hear more from Brother Lee?" A loud chorus came, "Yes." And so Brother Lee arose again and poured an apostolic blessing upon them, and they left satisfied. Brother Lee later said it was one of the most remarkable experiences he'd ever had, of where an entire congregation was overcome by the Holy Spirit.
Flying north across the continent, the Lees next stopped in Cairo, Egypt, where they visited the pyramids and other historic sites along the Nile before traveling on to the Holy Land. With war and unrest abundant in that region at the time, it was uncertain if they would be able to visit Jerusalem. But the Lord opened the necessary doors for their brief stay.
Leaving the land of Israel, the Lees traveled to various places in Europe, including Switzerland, where they visited the Swiss temple in Bern for the first time. The Lees also flew to Edinburgh, Scotland, where Fern was able to spend several invaluable days obtaining information about her Scottish ancestry. The apostle then made his final stop on the nearly 3-month, 35,000-mile journey, visiting the recently constructed London Temple.
Less than 1 year from the time they departed for South Africa, the Lees were again sent abroad on behalf of the First Presidency, this time to the missions of South and Central America. Traveling by ship from New York to Rio de Janeiro, the Lees arrived on September 7, 1959. After creating a new mission in Sao Paulo and installing a new president, Elder Lee traveled throughout the mission visiting with members and missionaries.
In the city of Londrina, the missionaries introduced Elder Lee to Alderasi dos Santos, the 5-year-old son of an investigator family. Alderasi had been born without the use of his legs, and the family had come to see Elder Lee with faith that he could heal their son. Joining with the missionaries, Elder Lee laid his hands on the boy's head and blessed him, rebuking the illness and commanding strength to return to the bones and muscles in his legs. Continuing their tour throughout the city, Elder and Sister Lee received word the very next day that Alderasi dos Santos was standing shakily on his legs. By December, the boy was even walking. The Dos Santos family soon joined the church, and as word of the healing spread through the mission, numerous others also entered the waters of baptism.
In Central America, the apostle and his wife visited the missions from Panama City all the way to Mexico City. In Guatemala, Elder Lee presided over a conference of nearly 1,600 church members. He wrote of these humble saints in his journal.
This is among the most distinctive Lamanite people I have yet seen. Somehow, I had a strong feeling that this place is without question the Lamanite capital of North America, and that a temple for the Latin American people should be built here.
Having completed another 3-month tour, Elder Lee returned to church headquarters and reported glowingly on the condition of the missionary work in South and Central America.
After only an 18-month hiatus, the Lees were again in the air, traveling this time to New Zealand and Australia, where they would spend several weeks meeting with and strengthening missionaries, church leaders, and members.
With the completion of his visit to the South Pacific, Harold B. Lee had now visited virtually all of the areas of church membership at that time. While this would seem like simple visits to members, in reality this was great preparation for his later service in the First Presidency and as president in what would then be a worldwide church.
On September 24th, 1962, Harold faced his greatest trial when Fern, his sweetheart of 40 years, passed away. Despite a powerful testimony of eternal marriage and a strong support network of family and friends, Elder Lee's feeling of loss was tremendous.
I was 8 when my grandmother passed away, and I well remember this experience. It was very difficult on my grandfather. He was heartbroken, but even in his great grief and sorrow, he thought of us, his grandchildren, and what it meant to us to be going through this experience at a young age. So he arranged to have a private viewing here at the home before the funeral. And he had us gather in the living room, and he stood by her side with the casket open so we could see her. And he taught us about where our Nana had gone and about the plan of salvation. And at the end, he broke down and he said, "I love you and I need you, and please stay close to me." And at that moment, my mother prompted me to go up and hug him and give him a kiss and assure him of my love. And the other grandchildren followed. And since that day, I have never feared death, because he taught us so beautifully at a young, tender age that there was nothing to fear. This was Heavenly Father's plan.
In November, Elder Lee was sent on assignment to Europe by the First Presidency, who hoped the journey would aid him in coping with his grief. His traveling companion on the trip was Elder Walter Stover, who wrote in his journal of Elder Lee's emotional state.
At that time, he was in deep sorrow for the loss of his beloved eternal companion, and I've seen him weep on many occasions. And it was very difficult for me to cheer him up. In Berlin, he was so depressed he had to go to his hotel room and turn the conference over to me.
When Elder Lee's wife, Fern, passed away, Brother Lee suffered immeasurably. He was almost inconsolable with grief. It was time, though, in January of 1963 for him to go to the Equitable Life Assurance Board meeting in New York City. While he was there, he was approached by a friend of his, a banker from Atlanta named John A. Sibley. Mr. Sibley pulled him aside with a sympathetic thought. He told him how he'd lost his own wife in an automobile crash. And he said, "Harold, this will be your greatest test, but if you can overcome this tragedy, there is nothing that will ever happen to you that you can't handle well." Amazingly, this experience came to him from a non-member banker. At the time, he was being consoled by his fellow apostles and associates in the church. But it had more influence, seemingly, than any other conversation. And from that time on, Brother Lee gathered himself up and went forward, and the healing process began.
Referring to his patriarchal blessing, Elder Lee also noted that the Lord had promised him wives and children. The plural term wives certainly gave the struggling apostle hope that his loneliness would eventually end. With his heart on the mend, Elder Lee contacted an old friend from the Western States Mission, Frida Joan Jensen. Harold soon invited Joan, as most called her, to visit him at his home in Salt Lake. He wrote of this meeting in his journal.
There was such a strange and wonderful peace from her visit that we both seemed to desire that such visits might be repeated. I had referred to our home as Fern's masterpiece, to which she later wrote,
"It is truly beautiful, a symphony of color, a beauty that lies in the accumulation of memories which nothing can wholly displace. Many thanks for a glimpse into paradise."
Following a sweet and simple courtship, Harold and Joan were sealed in the Salt Lake Temple on June 17, 1963, by President David O. McKay. To some, it may have seemed that Elder Lee remarried too quickly, but his daughter Helen understood that this is exactly what her mother Fern would have wanted. Helen had once spoken with Fern about a man in their ward who had remarried quickly after his wife's death. Helen was disappointed with the man, but Fern replied sincerely,
"Oh, my dear, you don't understand what it is to love someone. If I were to go before Daddy, and I think that we'll have to face that probability, I could never rest until I knew that your father was happily married again. I cannot bear the thoughts of him being alone and not having his needs cared for by someone who loves him as I do. I want him to remarry, and I mean soon after I go, so that he will not be lonely."
With Joan now at his side, Elder Lee continued to travel among the saints. However, tragedy struck again in August of 1965 while Elder Lee was on assignment in Hawaii. His oldest daughter, Maureen, died unexpectedly just days before her 40th birthday.
Maureen was the eldest of the two daughters of President Lee. I was married to Maureen Lee, and in 1965 we were living in Provo, where I was teaching at BYU. We had 4 children, and she was expecting the 5th child, which she hoped would be a little girl. Incident to her expectation, she developed an embolism, which was a blood clot, which eventually took her life. I immediately tried to contact her father, and eventually found him over in Hawaii doing church service there. As could be expected, the death of his daughter was the most devastating experience that he'd ever had. He took a plane and got to Provo as soon as he could and was there for the funeral.
Maureen's sudden death was undoubtedly the saddest experience of Elder Lee's life and further compounded his grief in losing Fern. After months of sleepless nights, and with help from a loving Heavenly Father, Elder Lee soon emerged from his bitter sorrow a stronger, more compassionate man. But his experience would never be forgotten and would be the key to his personal strength and spiritual power. Unfortunately, as Elder Lee continued to travel among the saints, health problems became a regular hindrance as a consequence of his age. However, the Lord was mindful of his servant.
When I was a mission president, I was president of the Florida mission. Brother Lee wanted to tour my mission, and he did, and it was just great. But he was sick the whole week that he was there. He dedicated 5 chapels that we had ready, and he had a bleeding ulcer. Every day I asked him, why don't we wait and come back in a month or 2 and finish? But he said, no, I want to get it done. And, you know, he stayed, and he left Florida, flew to New York, took care of some business, and then on the way home got terribly sick.
As he closed the conference in April of 1973, President Lee told a story that none of us in the family had ever heard before. He told of an experience when he'd been traveling back from the East. He and Aunt Joan had decided to come home early, and he said that while the flight was in midair, he felt hands on his head. And as he turned to look, no one was there. And then mid-flight, again, hands on his head. And he said when he landed, he was in some discomfort. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and they called his doctor, and they made an appointment to see him the next morning. But before the appointment, he began to hemorrhage. That was the original cause of his ulcers, and he was operated on for those ulcers soon thereafter the next day. I remember that experience because I had a hand in the aftermath. I was serving on an LDSSA student committee assigned to ask him to come speak to a fireside. And I didn't realize what I was asking because of his recent surgery, but I went to his home, and he was gracious enough to say, yes, I'll come. When I told him it was a fireside, he said, "Where will this fireside be held?" And I said, "In the tabernacle." And he said, "Oh, is that what they do with firesides these days?"
Elder Lee added this testimony.
I know that there are powers divine that reach out when all other help is not available. Yes, I know there are such powers.
In that same year, stomach ailments that had plagued Elder Lee for more than 15 years reached such severity that surgery became imperative. During the operation at the LDS hospital in Salt Lake, nearly half of his stomach was removed. Subsequent tests and surgery were required again in 1969.
In January of 1970, President David O. McKay passed away after 19 years of faithful service as prophet and president of the church. Joseph Fielding Smith was ordained in his stead at the special meeting of the apostles held on January 23rd. Harold B. Lee and N. Eldon Tanner were called as President Smith's counselors in the first presidency. During the 2.5 years that Elder Lee served in the first presidency, several important new programs were instituted. Chief among those were church security, public relations, and internal and external communications.
In the fall of 1971, President Lee participated in the historic first-ever area conference of the church. Presided over by President Smith, the conference was held in Manchester, England, and brought together all the saints of the British Isles. President Smith, who was 95 at the time, was becoming more and more frail, and less than a year later, he was called home to his Father in heaven just 17 days before his 96th birthday. President Lee's daughter Helen was with her father when he received the news of President Smith's death.
I'll never forget the look on his face. He kept repeating, "Oh no, no, oh no." He covered the phone receiver and looked as though all the cares in the world had suddenly settled upon him. He said to us so gravely, "President Smith is gone." I had never seen him look so weak and so completely at a loss. It was only a moment, however, until he straightened up, squared his shoulders, and began to take charge.
Of this dark and challenging moment, President Lee said the following.
He seemed in that brief moment to be passing to me, as it were, a scepter of righteousness, as though to say, "Go thou and do likewise."
It was significant that when grandfather was to become the president of the church upon President Smith's passing, that music also had a significant place. My sister Jane had prepared a solo that she had performed in a sacrament meeting when grandfather and Aunt Joan were away, and they had asked us to come for a family home evening so that they could hear her play. We didn't realize, however, that all of these events would unroll and that President Smith was to pass away. So we called thinking that he would not want us to keep that appointment, and he said, "Oh no, come. I would like you. I need you to be with me tonight." So Jane brought her violin, and we sat, and he asked us to join him in singing 2 hymns that he found particularly comforting at that moment. One was "I Need Thee Every Hour." And then he asked us to sing "How Firm a Foundation." And he said, "Would you please pay attention to the 3rd verse? Here's a man who had all of the keys, had all of the experience, and had all of the magnification. And he sought comfort in his family and in the music and in the message that comes from the hymns of the church."
In a meeting of the apostles on July 7th, Harold B. Lee again participated in the process of ordaining a new president of the church. This time, however, the experience was different. For this time, Harold was ordained under the hand of the apostles as prophet and 11th president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. President Lee selected N. Eldon Tanner and Marion G. Romney as his counselors, and they too were ordained in that special meeting.
Harold B. Lee became president of the church when he was 73 years old. He appeared in excellent health. He felt good. He'd had a few little problems, but I'm sure the membership of the church expected him to be president of the church for a very long time. He certainly hadn't experienced the kind of health problems that Spencer Kimball was experiencing and had, who was next in line to be president of the church. But alas, it wasn't to be so. Harold B. Lee was only president of the church for 18 months. A very brief amount of time, and the announcement of his death came very unexpectedly and a great surprise to the membership of the church.
After he became prophet of the church, President Lee's first big project was to hold another area conference, this time in Mexico. The Tabernacle Choir performed the music for the conference, and over 16,000 members from throughout Mexico and Central America attended. In his address, President Lee spoke of the church's growth in Mexico, noting that there were now nearly 115,000 Mexican saints. He also spoke of the love he held for the saints of Mexico and all the world, sharing a sacred experience he had the day after his ordination as president of the church.
As my wife and I kneeled in humble prayer, suddenly it seemed as though my mind and heart went out to all 3 million members throughout the world. I seemed to love every one of them, regardless of their nationality or their color, whether rich or poor, or educated or not. They were all my own brothers and sisters.
Unfortunately, President Lee's unconditional love was not always returned. Arriving back in Salt Lake, President Lee received word that 2 members of an apostate cult in Mexico were en route to Utah, where they planned to assassinate him. Church security was, of course, called into full action, and a previously planned trip to Europe proved very timely. Under police escort, President Lee was taken to the Salt Lake airport, where he and Joan were joined by Elder Gordon B. Hinckley and his wife, who would join them on their tour of Europe and the Middle East. On this trip, President Lee met first with government and church officials in England, then visited the London Temple, and set apart 7 brethren as sealers, while Elder Hinckley set about reorganizing the London Stake Presidency.
A humorous incident came out of the organization of the London Stake Presidency. Elder Hinckley had called a young 31-year-old John Henry Cox to be the stake president. However, he expressed his concern about the youth of this man to President Lee. President Lee simply passed a note to Elder Hinckley which read, "I was called as a stake president at age 31.
President Lee and company attended meetings in Athens, Greece, and then traveled to the Holy Land, where they met with government officials. Here, President Lee laid the groundwork for the raising of a monument on the Mount of Olives in commemoration of Orson Hyde's dedicatory prayer, as well as a visitor's center. The stress of travel, however, began taking its toll on the prophet, who found himself exhausted at the end of each day. Of this time, President Lee wrote in his journal,
I now realize I was skirting on the brink of eternity, and a miracle in this land of even greater miracles was extended by a merciful God, who obviously was prolonging my ministry for a longer time.
From Israel, the traveling prophet and apostle and their companions flew to Italy. There, they visited with members and missionaries in Florence, Pisa, and finally Milan, where they attended a conference with Mission President Dan Jorgensen and 140 of his missionaries. Traveling north, the general authorities finished their European tour in Switzerland, where President Lee called a new temple president and spoke to a gathering of over 300 saints in Lausanne.
In October of 1972, President Lee led the first of the only 3 general conferences over which he would preside.
You can't grow up in the family of an apostle without having many fond memories of General Conference. And for us, the good news was that it was a weekend when we could have grandfather at home. One of the exciting moments was general priesthood meeting on the Saturday night. The evening would start with the boys getting ready to go down to conference with grandfather, and he would drive down 2nd Avenue in his Buick and pick us up. But we would go, and we would be ushered into a special parking place, of course, go under the tunnels beneath the tabernacle and go up to a place reserved for what would normally be the wives of the general authorities.
One of the unique experiences with President Lee that we shared was coming back through the tunnel underneath the tabernacle and underneath Main Street, back to the parking garage after a priesthood meeting. President Lee was animated, and it had been an unusual outpouring of the Spirit that night in priesthood meeting, and he said to us as he escorted us back to the parking garage, "Did you hear what the Lord had to say to the brethren tonight?" And he was talking about what the Lord had said through him.
Later that month, President Lee announced the organization of an activity program in the church for single adults, called the Melchizedek Priesthood MIA. And during the following year, President Lee made a great effort to reach out to single adults in the church, speaking at college campuses throughout the Intermountain West whenever possible.
In June of 1973, President Lee participated in the open house for the newly constructed church office building in Salt Lake City. The 26-story high-rise brought together all the church personnel and staff that had previously been scattered in various buildings around Salt Lake. Later that year, at the October General Conference, President Lee, who was growing more tired and weak with each day of continued service, gave his final counsel to the saints whom he loved so very much.
We have never had a conference when there has been so much direct instruction, so much admonition, when the problems have been defined and also the solutions to the problems have been suggested. I know with a certainty that defies all doubt that this is His work, and that He is guiding us and directing us today as He has done in every dispensation of the gospel.
President Lee was weary during the month of December, but he was in reasonably good health. However, his calendar was filled with almost a daily reception by every department in the church, and it took its toll. When Christmas finally came, he was very tired, but finally he arrived for dinner, and he sat through the meal and the little program that followed, and then he went home, lingering, though, at the door, unusual as that was. And he seemed to have a blessing for each of our children, and he had a personal conversation with each one. And the next day, his wife called the doctor. The doctor said, "You go to the hospital and I'll check you out there where we can do more tests." And then about 3 o'clock, he finally walked into the LDS hospital, and there submitted to the tests that the doctors wanted to give to him. As the hours passed by, though, he seemed to be more and more weak, and he asked that we administer to him. So President Romney gave him a blessing, and later he sat up, had a glazed look in his eyes, and fell backwards. The resident physician came in and hollered, "Cardiac arrest." In moments, the room was a blur of activity, but after 1 hour, the Lord had spoken, and President Lee was called home.
Harold B. Lee passed away just before 9 p.m. on December 26, 1973. Within an hour, the news was announced on radio and television programs in Salt Lake City. People around the world, both inside and outside the church, were stunned.
Funeral services were held on a wet and dreary December 29th in the Tabernacle. The mood of the ceremony was summed up well by President Marion G. Romney, who said,
"We do not mourn today for President Lee, but for ourselves."
Once again, Harold B. Lee was ahead of his time. He seemed to do everything in his life at an earlier age than his peers. He started school before his friends. He was a school teacher at age 17, a stake president at age 31, and an apostle at 42. Now he was again getting a head start, this time on a new calling to the great work on the other side of the veil.
As a husband, a father, a teacher, a missionary, a stake president, an apostle, and a prophet, Harold B. Lee blessed the lives of all he came in contact with. And in doing so, he made their lives better, and in turn made the world a better place. Without question, Harold B. Lee had lived true to the destiny he had unknowingly found before him at that general conference so very long ago.
I've been moved, I think, as I've never been moved before in all my life. If it were not for the assurance that I have that the Lord is near to us, guiding, directing, the burden would almost be beyond my strength, but because I know that He's there and that He can be appealed to. And if we have ears to hear, attuned to Him, we'll never be left alone. And as I think of these great men whom the Lord has brought to our help, listen to them. I bear you my witness. As Brother Gordon Hinckley has said, I guess I was like that shaft that was polished. As I look back, maybe all of that had a purpose. But thank the Lord, maybe I've passed some of the tests. But maybe there'll have to be more before I shall have been polished. Sometimes when the veil has been very thin, if the struggle had been still more, maybe then there would have been no veil. But I stand by not asking for anything more than the Lord wants to give me. But I know that He is up there, and He's guiding and directing. I do bless the saints in all parts of the world. I bless those who are not members of the church. May we reach out to those who have lost their sense of direction. And before it's too late, try to win them back into the fold, because they're all God's children. Peace be with you. Not the peace that comes from legislation in the halls of Congress, but the peace that comes in the way that the Master said, by overcoming all the things of the world. That God may help us so to understand. And may you know that I know, with a certainty that defies all doubt, that this is His work, that He's guiding us and directing us today, as He has done in every dispensation of the gospel. And I say that with all the humility of my soul, and leave you my blessing in the name of the Lord.